The accepted narrative of the Battle of Plassey, enshrined in schoolbooks and public consciousness for centuries, is a comforting myth, a glorious military triumph where a small, disciplined British force heroically routed a vast, decadent Indian army. This story serves a purpose. It suggests the eventual rise of the British Empire in India was a consequence of inherent military superiority, a destiny fulfilled on a humid, blood-soaked field in 1757. But history, as ever, is far less tidy and far more unsettling than the narratives we build around it. We must challenge this foundation myth. The truth of Plassey is that it was not primarily a battle. It was a calculated, compromised act of political treachery, a venture whose success was guaranteed before the first shot was fired. It was a coup d'etat disguised as a military engagement, driven not by valor, but by avarice and cold-blooded political maneuvering. To understand the true mechanics of this victory is to understand the precise, morally complex nature of the British Empire's birth. Our setting is not a theatre of war in the European sense, but the province of Bengal in the 1750s, a region often casually overlooked by historians obsessed with the grand strategic sweep of the 7 Years' War. Yet, Bengal was, indisputably, the jewel of the East, a center of global trade, commerce, and textile production whose annual revenue outstripped the entire GDP of Great Britain at the time. This was a land of untold, almost unimaginable wealth, and as such, it became a focal point of intense, often brutal, competition. Into this opulent landscape stepped the British East India Company, or the EIC. Initially established solely for trade, the EIC quickly evolved into a peculiar, hybrid entity. It was a commercial corporation wielding sovereign power, driven by the ruthless pursuit of profit, yet supported by the distant, powerful authority of the British state. This duality, the pursuit of profit through the machinery of war, is the key anomaly of Bengal. The nominal ruler of Bengal was the young, volatile Nawab Siraj ud-Daulah. He inherited a vast, powerful but increasingly fragile court at Murshidabad, riddled with internal factions and profound systemic weaknesses. His authority was constantly undermined by a cabal of powerful financial magnates, the Jagat Seths, and ambitious military commanders. These men saw the Nawab not as a sovereign to be served, but as an obstacle to be bypassed in their own pursuit of stability and, crucially, greater financial return. The EIC, based in their fortified trading post at Calcutta, did not conquer Bengal through direct, large-scale invasion. They conquered it through a meticulous, patient strategy of subversion. They recognized and exploited the critical, self-serving divisions within the Nawab's court. The immense wealth of Bengal had, ironically, fostered a culture of deep-seated corruption, ambition, and disloyalty amongst the Nawab's inner circle, a poison that the EIC was all too happy to administer. The perceived military victory at Plassey was, therefore, merely the final, necessary punctuation mark on a political campaign already won in the shadows of Murshidabad's palaces and Calcutta's counting houses. To credit the British force of roughly 3,000 men with defeating an army 16 times its size through simple bravery is to dangerously simplify the narrative. It ignores the months of intense, highly sensitive negotiation, the promises of future wealth and power made to key betrayers, and the political guarantees secured by Robert Clive that the Nawab's immense army would be paralyzed by institutionalized inaction when it mattered most. The accepted mythology allows us to focus on the brief, dramatic hours of combat. The true, forgotten truth forces us to look beyond the battlefield and into the deep systemic corruption and geopolitical machinations that made that day possible. It forces us to ask, what is the real cost, political and moral, of a victory purchased not with courage, but with currency? This, then, is the revisionist task, to strip away the veneer of heroism and to expose the cold, calculating heart of what really happened at Plassey. The accepted narrative, focused as it is on the immediate drama of the battlefield, fails to address the profound and inescapable reality that the small, precarious forces of the East India Company in Bengal were merely a sharp, opportunistic instrument of a much larger, global conflict. The true genesis of Plassey is found not in Calcutta or Murshidabad, but in the drawing rooms of Whitehall and the financial markets of the City of London, where the vast, complex, and often corrupt machinations of the 7 Years' War were being orchestrated. This was not a localized commercial squabble. It was the decisive phase of the long, existential struggle for global commercial and imperial supremacy between Great Britain and France. By the mid-1750s, the war had stretched across 4 continents, from the forests of North America to the coastlines of West Africa and the trade routes of the East Indies. The central, unyielding problem for the British government, as for any 18th-century state, was solvency. Wars were astronomically expensive, and the ability to maintain a strong navy and subsidize European allies depended entirely upon the uninterrupted flow of wealth. This is precisely where Bengal assumed its extraordinary, strategic importance. Bengal was the principal source of high-value goods, cotton, silk, saltpeter, that underpinned the EIC's trade. The profit generated in Bengal, known as the investment, was essential for maintaining the balance of payments for Britain's global war effort. If France could successfully cut off or seize the Bengal trade, the financial bedrock of the British state, and thus its ability to prosecute the war against France in Europe and elsewhere, would be fundamentally undermined. The EIC's security in Bengal, therefore, transitioned overnight from being a corporate concern to a matter of national strategic imperative. Yet, to look at the EIC's internal structure in London is to observe not a disciplined arm of the state, but a political battlefield of its own. The company's General Court of Proprietors, a volatile assembly of shareholders, held ultimate power. It was a system ripe for systemic corruption. Men who had acquired fortunes in India, the notorious nabobs, returned to London, bought up shares, and then leveraged their voting power to secure influence, lucrative appointments, and, crucially, to fend off any attempts at moral or financial regulation by Parliament. These men had a vested, financial interest in maintaining the status quo of exploitation in India, and their voices were loud and often decisive in Whitehall. The political decision-making around India was therefore a messy, often contradictory affair, caught between the national need for strategic security and the nabob's insatiable appetite for personal gain. The government, perpetually short of funds and reliant on the EIC's customs duties, largely tolerated this internal rot. This compromise, the state using a private, corrupt entity to execute a national strategy, is the rotten heart of Whitehall that made Plassey possible. The commission given to Robert Clive was born from this toxic synthesis. He was sent to Bengal not to formally conquer a nation in the name of the king, but to secure the company's revenue streams and check the French. He operated in a grey area, backed by the implicit threat of Royal Navy power, but funded and directed by the rapacious, profit-driven Court of Proprietors. Clive understood this duality perfectly. He knew that the only language spoken fluently by both the directors in Leadenhall Street and the courtiers in Murshidabad was finance. His strategy to conquer Bengal was therefore a uniquely British imperial invention of the era, a fusion of precise, disciplined military force and sophisticated, financially motivated political subversion. It was an operation sanctioned not by a clean, moral foreign policy, but by the pragmatic, financially desperate geopolitical necessity of a nation fighting a global war using a mechanism, the EIC, that was already profoundly compromised by the self-interest of its own shareholders and executives. The victory at Plassey, then, was less a glorious moment of military heroism and more the inevitable, ugly result of a complex, well-funded geopolitical pressure campaign exerted by a financially astute, war-addicted state through its unscrupulous commercial arm. The wealth of Bengal was merely the means to win the 7 Years' War, and the EIC's political manipulation was the most effective, cheapest tool for acquiring it. The military campaign against the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj ud-Daulah, was not conceived in a strategic war room, but within the claustrophobic, gilded confines of his own court at Murshidabad. To understand the impossible odds that Clive purportedly overcame, one must first grasp the depth of the rot that had consumed the Nawab's authority. The victory at Plassey was guaranteed because the center of power had already been thoroughly compromised by avarice. Murshidabad was, in the 1750s, a labyrinth of wealth, a city whose fortunes rivaled any in Europe. But beneath this surface glitter, the court was terminally divided. The young Nawab, Siraj ud-Daulah, had inherited his throne upon the death of his grandfather, Alivadi Khan, without the universal backing required to maintain authority. He was viewed by many established powers, the financiers, the generals, and the landed aristocracy, not as a legitimate ruler, but as an erratic impediment to their own stability and prosperity. Central to this internal resistance were the Jagat Seths, meaning world bankers. This giant family commanded a financial network so vast that they effectively controlled the economy of Bengal. They were the primary lenders to the court and possessed the capital necessary to fund and dismantle armies. When the Nawab alienated them, whether through personal slights or excessive taxation, he forfeited the financial backbone of his own regime. The Jagat Seths, therefore, were the first and most critical point of vulnerability that the East India Company systematically exploited. For them, the chaos of a British-backed coup was merely a commercial transaction to protect their assets. Alongside the financiers stood the disgruntled military leadership, personified by Mir Jafar. As the commander-in-chief of the Nawab's massive army, Mir Jafar commanded the loyalty of perhaps half of the troops. He was deeply resentful of the young Nawab's trust in other, newer advisers and nursed a palpable desire for the throne himself. To Mir Jafar, the EIC presented a crucial opportunity, an external, disciplined military force willing to act as the lever to remove Siraj ud-Daulah, with the promise that he, in turn, would be installed as a puppet Nawab. This ambition was the fuel for the treachery. The EIC's resident in Calcutta, and later Robert Clive himself, understood instinctively that in a state defined by such wealth, loyalties were mercenary, not moral. They recognized that the immense treasury of the Nawab was the ultimate prize, and that the path to this prize was paved not with cannons, but with contracts. The EIC's strategy was thus a cold, calculated exercise in elite capture. The objective of the political maneuvering was not to defeat 50,000 men on the field, it was to neutralize 47,000 of those men before the battle even began. The treaty forged in secret between Clive and the conspirators, Mir Jafar, the Jagat Seths, and others, was not a defensive alliance. It was a regime change manifesto with a massive financial settlement clause. This arrangement guaranteed that when the two armies met, the sheer numerical superiority of the Nawab would be rendered irrelevant by the strategic, systemic inaction of his own commanders. The 50,000-man army was, in reality, a powerful phantom, a vast, inert mass waiting for a signal that would never come. The wealth of Murshidabad, which should have secured the Nawab's position, had instead acted as a poison, breeding the intense ambition and disloyalty that ultimately led to his downfall. Plassey was not a victory achieved by British arms against impossible odds. It was a political assassination funded by Bengali gold and executed by Bengali traitors, with Clive's small, disciplined force merely providing the necessary, decisive military presence to guarantee the contract's execution. The events that precipitated Robert Clive's mission to Bengal, and which provided the necessary, thin veneer of moral justification for the EIC's subsequent political treachery, trace back directly to the notorious incident known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. This event, often recounted in isolation as an act of singular barbarism, was in reality the crisis of reckoning that forced the hand of the British establishment and legitimized the campaign of regime change in the eyes of London. The genesis of the crisis lay in the Nawab Siraj ud-Daulah's growing exasperation with the EIC's continuous, escalating overreach. The company, in defiance of his authority, had begun strengthening the fortifications of their trading post at Fort William in Calcutta. They refused to halt the construction and, worse, were providing political asylum to certain Bengali merchants and officials who had incurred the Nawab's displeasure. For Siraj ud-Daulah, this was not merely commercial impudence, it was a profound violation of his sovereignty and a direct challenge to his rule. No independent state could tolerate a foreign entity building up a military base within its borders and defying its writs of justice. Consequently, in June 1756, the Nawab marched on Calcutta with a large force. The EIC's military response was utterly shambolic. Their defense was inept, and the senior leadership, including Governor Roger Drake, abandoned the city and its remaining garrison in a panic, fleeing down the Hooghly River. This act of institutional cowardice left the ordinary British and Indian residents, along with a small, ill-equipped garrison, to face the inevitable. Following the Nawab's relatively easy capture of Fort William, a group of European prisoners, the precise number is a matter of perennial scholarly debate, though popular history claims 146 were confined overnight in a small, cramped military prison cell known as the Black Hole. The conditions within the stifling space were horrific. Lacking ventilation and water in the intense Bengali heat, many perished from heat exhaustion, suffocation, and thirst. The precise figures are secondary to the political effect. When the doors were opened the next morning, a significant number of Europeans were dead. This incident, whether a deliberate act of cruelty by the Nawab's guards or a tragic, unintended consequence of bureaucratic indifference, was immediately seized upon by the EIC and its backers in Britain. It was meticulously and relentlessly amplified through the press and parliament, transforming a local military tragedy into a powerful moral rallying cry. The narrative was simple, visceral, and effective. The Nawab was a barbaric tyrant who murdered defenseless British citizens. The Black Hole provided the political catalyst that superseded mere commercial interest. It shifted the debate from whether the EIC should secure its trading rights to whether Great Britain had a moral obligation to avenge its dead and protect its subjects from Oriental despotism. This allowed the British authorities to frame the subsequent military expedition under Clive not as an act of colonial aggression or an opportunistic coup, but as a righteous act of retribution and deliverance. It granted Clive the necessary public and official mandate to pursue a policy of regime change, the political removal of the Nawab, which otherwise would have been difficult to sanction. The blood spilled in that small prison cell gave the EIC the pretext they needed to launch a campaign that was ultimately driven by the vast, untapped wealth of Bengal, but which could now be cloaked in the urgent language of honor, justice, and self-defense. The tragedy became the ultimate, convenient justification for the grand strategic, financial gamble that culminated at Plassey. The man at the heart of this geopolitical maelstrom and the ultimate executioner of the plan at Plassey was Robert Clive, a figure whose biography is less a traditional military history and more a testament to the peculiar, unforgiving nature of the East India Company. Clive was not born into the martial aristocracy. He arrived in Madras in 1744 not as an officer, but as a writer, or clerk, a low-rung functionary tasked with the tedious arithmetic of commerce. This non-traditional beginning is crucial, for it meant Clive's authority was forged outside the rigid, often complacent structures of the regular British Army, making him the absolute apotheosis of the EIC man. Clive's early years in India were marked by a profound, almost suicidal discontent. He was an outsider, perpetually restless, surviving at least 2 confirmed attempts on his own life. This inherent volatility, however, translated on the battlefield into a ruthless, near-fatalistic determination. He was a man who had already faced death and therefore commanded without the fear that governed his contemporaries. When the conflicts with the French and their Indian allies erupted in the Carnatic region, Clive found his true vocation, trading the ledger for the sword. His transformation began with the Siege of Arcot in 1751. With only 200 European soldiers and 300 sepoys, Clive seized the city and then endured a 53-day siege against a far superior force. This audacious, counterintuitive move established 2 indelible traits of Clive's command: aggressive action in the face of impossible odds, and, crucially, a deep, professional respect for the capabilities of his European-trained Indian sepoys. Arcot was not just a victory, it was a doctrinal statement that small, disciplined forces, when aggressively commanded, could decisively defeat the large, loosely organized feudal levies of the local powers. This rapid, unconventional rise created immediate and lasting institutional resistance. The regular officers of the king's army, steeped in the formal traditions of European warfare and aristocratic hierarchy, deeply mistrusted Clive. They saw him as a mercenary upstart, a clerk who had bought his commission and whose methods were dangerously unorthodox. This deep-seated contempt from the establishment was a constant in Clive's career, but it also granted him a necessary freedom. Because he was never truly of the king's army, He was free to develop a unique military doctrine tailored specifically for the Indian theatre, unburdened by the inflexible orthodoxies of European protocol. Clive's genius lay in his ability to fuse military professionalism with political realism. He understood that in India, the art of war was inseparable from the art of intrigue and finance. He did not rely on overwhelming force, he relied on leveraging local division. He recognized that the true weakness of the Indian princes was not the lack of soldiers, but the lack of loyalty among their commanders, a weakness that could always be exploited with hard currency. The EIC's structure, which allowed men to pass seamlessly between mercantile, political, and military roles, perfectly suited Clive's temperament. He could be a negotiator one day, forging treaties and promising fortunes, and a decisive battlefield commander the next, ready to enforce those contracts with a bayonet. He was ruthless, self-serving, and ultimately, profoundly effective. His enormous, later scandalous personal fortune, acquired through gifts and plunder, was simply the logical extension of the EIC's raison d'etre, profit through power. By the time he sailed for Calcutta to avenge the Black Hole, Clive was a commander of proven, almost mythical reputation, but he was also a man accustomed to operating in the moral and political shadows. He had already demonstrated that he would, without hesitation, utilize forgery, bribery, and political coercion if they offered the quickest, most efficient path to securing the company's interests. His appointment was thus a reflection of the EIC's own brutal calculation. They needed not a hero, but a man ruthless enough to execute a political plan under the guise of military action. Robert Clive was the perfect distillation of the company's immoral effectiveness, the necessary rogue whose command principles would lead directly to the political and military contract known as Plassey. The popular image of the Battle of Plassey focuses narrowly on the small body of British redcoats, but the truth of the victory, and indeed, of the rise of British power in India, rests on a forgotten doctrine, the hyper-reliance on disciplined, European-trained sepoy contingents. Robert Clive's success was not a miracle of Anglo-Saxon supremacy. It was a masterful application of military doctrine centered on the sepoy as the ultimate force multiplier, a system far superior to the feudal armies of the Nawab. Clive's specific military philosophy, forged in the harsh, pragmatic environment of the Carnatic Wars, was fundamentally about discipline and consistency. He recognized that the vast armies of Indian rulers, while formidable in sheer numbers, such as the Nawab's force of 50,000, were often composed of diverse, ill-paid, and poorly motivated levies. These forces were large in mass, but brittle in structure. They fought based on the charisma of their individual leaders, and if those leaders fell or proved disloyal, the entire force could dissolve into a rout. The EIC sepoy, by contrast, represented a radical departure. These were Indian soldiers, recruited locally, but trained meticulously in the European style of war. They were drilled relentlessly in the core principles of musketry and volley fire, taught to hold their ground in linear formations, and, crucially, to maintain their discipline and cohesion under enemy fire, a feature the Nawab's forces almost entirely lacked. The sepoy was given a regular wage, better than his counterparts in the local armies, and importantly, his pay was guaranteed. This financial consistency instilled a loyalty to the institution, the company's flag, rather than to a fleeting prince. This emphasis on institutional loyalty was the true genius of the EIC system. It created a force that was less susceptible to the political intrigues and financial temptations that plagued the Nawab's command. While Mir Jafar's promises could paralyze 47,000 of the Nawab's troops, Clive could rely implicitly on his sepoys to perform their duty with professional, unyielding discipline. This small, highly professionalized corps of Indian troops was, in essence, the steel spine of the entire EIC military operation. The difference was made clearest in their firepower doctrine. The Nawab's army relied on slow, heavy artillery and masses of poorly coordinated infantry whose muskets fired sporadically and often ineffectually. Clive's doctrine, which he imparted equally to his British and sepoy battalions, was focused on the rapid, synchronized volley. This tactic, where disciplined lines of men delivered a concentrated sheet of lead at close range, was devastatingly effective against massed formations and represented a tactical advantage that no numerical disparity could overcome. The emphasis was on a high rate of effective fire, not brute numbers. Furthermore, the logistical efficiency of the sepoy contingent was paramount. They were an army built for rapid deployment and decisive action. The EIC logistical chain, while basic, was dependable. This contrasted sharply with the massive, sprawling camp followers and cumbersome supply train of the Nawab's army, which often slowed movement and complicated command. Clive's ability to move his small force quickly across the Bhagirathi River and establish a tactical position within the Plassey mango grove was a direct consequence of this streamlined, disciplined logistical doctrine. In the narrative of impossible odds, the sepoy contingent offers a profound revisionist lesson. Clive did not achieve victory by magically elevating a small English force. He won by exploiting a systemic asymmetry in military doctrine. He used the immense manpower of the Indian subcontinent, refined and focused by European discipline, to turn against the very rulers who failed to professionalize their own armies. Plassey was, therefore, the crowning success of a specific, pragmatic military principle, that a small, disciplined, and financially dependable force will always triumph over a vast, undisciplined, and politically compromised one. The sepoy was not a supporting player. He was the essential engine of Clive's forgotten doctrine. The seemingly miraculous nature of Plassey often overshadows the crucial precondition for Clive's success, the utter systemic incompetence that defined the East India Company's military ventures prior to his arrival. Clive did not merely introduce a superior doctrine, he filled a glaring military void created by years of poor leadership, inadequate logistics, and an inflexible adherence to outdated European military orthodoxy that was demonstrably failing in the brutal, fluid environment of the subcontinent. Prior to the Carnatic Wars and the rise of men like Clive, the EIC's military strategy was reactive, expensive, and deeply inefficient. The company relied primarily on small, isolated garrisons focused on defense, and its expeditions were frequently hampered by the amateurish quality of its command structure. Senior positions were often filled not based on martial merit, but through patronage and the purchase of commissions. This practice ensured that many commanders lacked the necessary practical experience or intellectual flexibility to adapt to the unique challenges of Indian warfare. This systemic failure was most evident in the realm of logistics and financial management. Campaigns frequently faltered not due to enemy action, but because of a breakdown in supply chains. Pay for both British regulars and Indian sepoys was often late or inconsistent, leading to desertion, indiscipline, and outright mutiny. The EIC's financial executives in the presidency capitals often treated military expenditure as an unnecessary drain on profits, rather than as a strategic investment. This parsimonious, short-sighted approach crippled the combat effectiveness of forces on the ground, ensuring that even when the EIC technically possessed a capable force, the will and means to deploy it effectively were constantly undermined. Furthermore, the early EIC and British regular officers were often paralyzed by their adherence to European orthodoxy. They attempted to fight campaigns in the grand, predictable style of the European theatres, siege warfare, reliance on heavy guns, and formal, set-piece battles designed for the open plains of Flanders or Germany. They failed to grasp the significance of local intelligence, the effectiveness of light cavalry, or the necessity of incorporating local fighting styles. This rigid, colonial mindset dismissed the value of their Indian opponents and, crucially, failed to maximize the potential of their own sepoy recruits. Their doctrine was a costly transplant that repeatedly wilted in the Indian heat. A crucial example of this incompetence occurred in the early engagements in the Madras and Carnatic regions, where the EIC struggled against both the French and their local allies. The frequent loss of strategic settlements and the repeated inability to follow up minor victories with decisive action highlighted the deep-seated flaws in their command and control. There was a lack of unified purpose, with commanders often more concerned with the acquisition of personal wealth than the execution of strategic objectives. This created a cycle of defeat and near bankruptcy that threatened the entire commercial venture. Clive, therefore, did not emerge into a functional military machine. He stepped into a void of effective command. His success was predicated on his immediate and complete rejection of this accepted EIC military orthodoxy. He discarded the slow, cumbersome logistics, bypassed the politically appointed senior officers where possible, and, most importantly, trusted the superior doctrine forged at Arcot, a doctrine that was flexible, aggressive, and centered on the disciplined power of the trained sepoy. His rise was a direct institutional response to years of demonstrable failure. The directors in London, chastened by repeated disasters and facing the immense financial pressure of the French War, were eventually compelled to grant authority to a proven, if unorthodox, winner like Clive. The decision to back Clive's audacious political military plan for Bengal was not a sign of the EIC's strength, but a sign of their desperation to correct the systemic incompetence that had brought them to the brink of disaster. Clive's genius was not only in winning the Battle of Plassey but in recognizing and ruthlessly exploiting the military and logistical failures of his own side that preceded him. The true engine of the victory at Plassey was not the volley fire of the sepoys nor the charge of the British regulars. It was the series of protracted, morally compromising deals hammered out in the shadows of Calcutta and Murshidabad, the shadow negotiations that forged the unholy alliance between the East India Company and the Nawab's disloyal grandees. This phase of the operation was Robert Clive's most important act of command, revealing him to be a political realist of ruthless efficiency. The negotiations were initiated in the wake of the Calcutta disaster, driven by the absolute strategic certainty that a purely military campaign against 50,000 men would be an unnecessary and devastating risk. Clive and the EIC Select Committee understood that the path to victory lay in internal destabilization, exploiting the deep-seated grievances of the Nawab's inner circle. The key targets were identified with cold precision: Mir Jafar, the disgruntled commander-in-chief, whose ambition was the throne itself; the Jugat Seths, the world bankers, whose fear of the volatile Nawab superseded all other loyalties; and several other powerful, wealthy Bengali officials. The fundamental premise of the negotiations was simple. The EIC would act as the military guarantor of a coup d'etat, removing Siraj ud-Daulah and installing Mir Jafar as the new, pliable Nawab. In exchange, the EIC demanded an unprecedented price. This price was not merely financial, it was the cession of sovereignty. Mir Jafar, upon installation, was required to grant the EIC the zamindari, land ownership rights, over a vast tract of land south of Calcutta, pay a massive indemnity to the company for the losses at Fort William, and, critically, bestow immense personal fortunes upon Clive and the other key negotiators. The scale of the financial demands, hundreds of thousands of pounds in gifts to individuals, aside from the millions for the company, underscored the mercenary nature of the alliance. The negotiations quickly devolved into a complex, high-stakes game of bluff and counterbluff, fraught with paranoia. Mir Jafar, though desperate for the throne, was hesitant. Committing outright treason was an act that, if discovered, meant certain death. He demanded guarantees of EIC protection and was initially reluctant to meet the full scale of the financial settlement demanded by Clive. This mutual suspicion necessitated the involvement of an intermediary, Amin Chand, or Amachand, a wealthy Bengali merchant who had the ear of all parties. Amin Chand, however, threatened to expose the entire conspiracy to the Nawab, demanding an exorbitant sum of £300,000 for himself, a sum Clive deemed unacceptable and a threat to the secrecy of the operation. This moment marks the deepest moral abyss of the entire campaign, forcing Clive into an act of calculated deception that would later haunt his career during parliamentary scrutiny. Clive, with the full complicity of the Select Committee, engineered a double treaty. Two versions of the treaty were prepared. The true, genuine treaty, written on white paper, outlined the real terms of the political and financial deal with Mir Jafar and the other conspirators, excluding the extortionate demands of Amin Chand. The second treaty, written on red paper, was a forgery. It included a clause promising Amin Chand his enormous sum. The justification for this blatant forgery was simple. Deceit was necessary to save the conspiracy and protect the national strategic interest. Clive famously coerced Admiral Watson, the naval commander, into signing the fraudulent Red Treaty. When Watson refused on grounds of principle, Clive is alleged to have forged his signature himself. This act of forgery and political treachery was the dark linchpin of the operation. It secured the silence of the intermediary and locked Mir Jafar into the agreement, giving him no choice but to proceed. The success of the coup now hinged on the delivery of the promised funds and the physical presence of Clive's army. The completion of the shadow negotiations defined the precise nature of the impossible odds. When Clive crossed the Bajarathi River, committing his small force to the heart of Bengal, he did so with absolute confidence that the numerical disparity was irrelevant. He was relying not on a decisive tactical innovation, but on a political contract that guaranteed strategic inaction from the bulk of the enemy. The 50,000 men arrayed against him were already compromised. They were not an army fighting for their sovereign, they were a vast, inert mass commanded by a man who had already agreed to their defeat. The shadow negotiations, therefore, represent the truest expression of the EIC's strategy, a victory purchased with forged documents, immense financial incentives, and the cold-blooded manipulation of human ambition. They established the blueprint for British imperial expansion, not through superior numbers, but through the corruption of local elites. It was a triumph of finance and deceit over conventional arms. Having concluded the complex, morally dubious shadow negotiations, Robert Clive faced the definitive moment of command, the physical act of committing his small force to an attack deep within the Nawab's territory. This was the point of no return, where political contract had to meet military reality. The immediate days preceding the battle were defined by the immense burden of command, a profound psychological pressure resting on Clive's shoulders, where the success of the entire, high-stakes venture hinged entirely on the anticipated treachery of Mir Jafar. Clive's army, a small contingent of approximately 3,000 men, roughly 900 British regulars, 2,100 disciplined sepoys, and a handful of artillery pieces, had marched north from Calcutta. Their movement was rapid, designed to seize the initiative before the Nawab could fully consolidate his forces or, worse, discover the extent of the conspiracy. The Rubicon in this campaign was the Bajarathi River, a tributary of the Ganges. To cross it meant abandoning all lines of communication and retreat. Once across, Clive's force would be isolated in the heart of Bengal, facing the full, terrifying might of the Nawab's army, which was reported to number at least 50,000 men with heavy artillery and significant French-trained contingents. The dilemma facing Clive on June 21, 1757, was acute and terrifyingly simple. He had received conflicting intelligence and, crucially, only ambiguous messages from Mir Jafar. The political contract he had invested everything in was suddenly unstable. Could he trust a man whose loyalty he had purchased to betray his own sovereign at the critical moment? If Mir Jafar faltered, or if the conspiracy had been exposed, Clive's tiny army would be annihilated, the company's interests in India would be destroyed, and he himself would face execution. The scale of the risk was absolute, a fact that weighed heavily on his often volatile temperament. Under this intense pressure, Clive did something highly unusual for a commander. He convened a council of war with his senior officers. The question was laid bare: should they cross the Bajarathi and engage the enemy immediately, or should they wait for further intelligence, perhaps consolidating their position until the monsoon season offered a better defensive opportunity? The decision of the council was a near-unanimous vote against crossing. The officers, viewing the disparity in numbers through the lens of pure military arithmetic, deemed the risk unacceptable. Their cautious, conventional judgment was sound. Clive, however, was a commander whose vision transcended mere arithmetic. He knew that the moment for decisive action was fleeting. Hesitation would only empower the Nawab, demoralize the conspirators, and potentially allow the plot to unravel completely. If he paused, Mir Jafar might defect back to the Nawab, or the French might intervene with more effective aid. The political momentum, which was the real weapon of this campaign, would be lost. After the council disbanded, Clive retreated to an adjacent mango grove for an hour of solitary contemplation. He was wrestling not with tactics, but with the certainty of the political outcome versus the uncertainty of the military risk. He ultimately overrode the consensus of his officers. His decision was based not on military courage alone, but on a pragmatic, ruthless calculation. The chance of complete victory via the coup was worth the risk of complete annihilation. He judged the corruption of the Nawab's court to be so deep that Mir Jafar, having committed to the agreement and seen the immense wealth promised, could not now afford to back out. Issuing the order to cross the river the next morning, June 22, was the definitive act of faith in the power of treachery and the weakness of the Bengal regime. It transformed the campaign from a political gamble into a high-stakes, irreversible military maneuver. When the last boat pushed off, Clive had effectively signed a binding contract for either an empire or a mass grave. This moment of solitary defiance against the council of his officers perfectly encapsulated Clive's unique, often brutal, command style, a commitment to a plan of high politics that required a terrifying military commitment, crossing the final, fatal line. The confrontation on June 23, 1757, took place not on an open, decisive plain, but within a highly specific, confined landscape that shaped the ensuing hours of conflict. To understand the technical and tactical climax of Plassey, one must first meticulously analyze the terrain of treachery. The very ground upon which the armies arrayed themselves was inherently defensive, a feature that magnified the overwhelming numerical disparity and thus underscored the criticality of the political conspiracy. The battlefield itself was a relatively small, crescent-shaped area bordered on one side by the Bhagirathi River. Clive's small force, having crossed the river the previous night, immediately occupied a highly advantageous position, the mango grove, or Lakshya Bar. This dense orchard, approximately 800 yards long and 300 yards wide, offered critical natural advantages. Its thick trees and surrounding embankments provided immediate cover and concealment from the Nawab's overwhelming artillery fire. The grove served as a ready-made, secure defensive position, allowing Clive to maintain his cohesion and protect his vital powder stores from the intense humidity and the sudden, anticipated monsoon downpours. Arrayed opposite this small, fortified grove lay the immense forces of Nawab Siraj ud-Daulah. His 50,000-strong army, complete with cavalry, infantry, and heavy guns, stretched for over 2.5 miles, forming a massive arc across the open ground. This sheer geographical sprawl demonstrated the Nawab's confidence in his numbers. His deployment placed his troops along a line of mud embankments and nullahs, deep drainage ditches, that offered further protection and effectively masked the extent of his main force. Key to the Nawab's strength was his artillery. His heavy guns, many of them handled by a small but highly effective contingent of French gunners and supported by their own European-style infantry, were positioned along the embankments facing the mango grove. These large-caliber cannons possessed a greater range and striking power than the company's lighter, more mobile field pieces. The Nawab's deployment maximized this technical superiority, allowing him to initiate the battle with a thunderous initial cannonade designed to simply obliterate Clive's entrenched position. The critical tactical chokepoint on the field was a cluster of buildings just north of the mango grove, a hunting lodge and an adjacent small redoubt or mound. This feature, positioned slightly forward from the main embankment line, offered a commanding view of the center of the Nawab's line and access to the main road. The French artillery contingent was initially placed near this redoubt, making it the most aggressively positioned element on the field. Clive correctly identified this mound as the single most important piece of terrain to seize if a counterattack were ever to be launched. The terrain itself was therefore a paradox. It favored the small, defensive force of Clive, providing essential protection against the initial cannonade. Yet, the open ground stretching out from the mango grove was perfectly suited to the massive cavalry charges and overwhelming numbers of the Nawab's army, should they ever be effectively commanded. This geometry of the battlefield, the fortified company position facing the sprawling, numerically superior, yet politically paralyzed enemy, magnified the stakes of the conspiracy. Clive's strategy was thus dictated by the terrain: hold the defensive position in the grove, endure the cannonade, and wait for the political signal. The terrain was not just physical space, it was a canvas upon which the negotiated act of betrayal was to be executed. The Nawab's commanders, particularly Mir Jafar, were positioned at the far western end of the line, geographically separated from the French and Loyalist forces, a separation that was intentional and critical to ensuring their strategic inaction when the battle was joined. The field of Plassey was ready, a perfect stage for a military confrontation whose outcome was already guaranteed by the pre-existing treachery inherent in the landscape's deployment. The initial hours of the Battle of Plassey were defined not by the small arms fire of the infantry, but by the thunderous roar of artillery. The conventional narrative often neglects a crucial technical detail. In terms of sheer firepower and caliber, the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj ud-Daulah, actually possessed a demonstrable superiority over the East India Company. This superiority was not only numerical but qualitative, yet it ultimately proved to be an illusion of power, undermined by logistical frailty and, critically, by the treachery that pervaded his high command. The Nawab's arsenal was formidable. His heavy artillery pieces, large-caliber guns that fired shots weighing up to 32 pounds, far outclassed the company's lighter, more mobile 6-pounder and 3-pounder field guns. These massive cannons were positioned prominently along the Nawab's entrenched embankments, designed to deliver a sustained, devastating cannonade against the small, vulnerable EIC position in the mango grove. The sheer volume of fire unleashed at the break of dawn was intended to shatter the cohesion and morale of Clive's exposed force before the infantry clash could even commence. Crucially, the operation of this heavy artillery was overseen by the most professional, disciplined fighting element in the Nawab's employ, a small, dedicated contingent of French gunners and their sepoy allies. Unlike the rest of the Nawab's army, which operated under a decentralized, feudal structure, the French forces were led by Monsieur Saint-Frey and employed European standards of gunnery, aiming, and positioning. Their presence near the critical redoubt on the field represented the only truly modern, loyal, and efficient military asset available to the Nawab. It was this French-led cannonade that inflicted the majority of the few casualties suffered by Clive's force and necessitated the EIC's immediate retreat into the deeper protection of the mango grove. The illusion of the Nawab's power, however, began to crack immediately under close technical scrutiny. While his guns were heavier, they were also critically less mobile. Transporting and repositioning the massive cannons was a slow, arduous process that required elephants and scores of men. This logistical encumbrance meant that once the battle began to move, or once the EIC shifted their position, the Nawab's main firepower could not keep pace or adapt. The company's lighter, highly mobile field guns, by contrast, could be swiftly maneuvered by small detachments of British sailors and sepoys, allowing Clive to concentrate his fire where and when it was needed most. Furthermore, the Nawab's logistical chain suffered from a profound and fatal flaw: the protection of powder. In the humid, volatile climate of Bengal, the meticulous protection of gunpowder was a paramount technical requirement. The sheer arrogance of the Nawab's commanders, confident in their numerical advantage, led to a dangerous negligence. When the inevitable monsoon downpour struck the battlefield later that morning, the Nawab's forces had failed to adequately cover their powder and ammunition stores. This was not an act of God, it was a logistical failure rooted in systemic incompetence. As the rain saturated the unprotected powder, the vast majority of the Nawab's heavy artillery was rendered inert, suddenly transforming his firepower superiority into complete tactical silence. Conversely, Clive's disciplined EIC forces, adhering to the standard operating procedures of European armies, had secured their powder in waterproof containers or under canvas within the dry confines of the mango grove. When the rain ceased, Clive's guns were ready to fire, the Nawab's guns were not. The Nawab's heavy artillery, therefore, was merely an impressive, static show of force. It was an illusion of power that was quickly revealed to be hollow, lacking the necessary logistical resilience and professional oversight to function effectively beyond the initial, predetermined bombardment. The silence of the Nawab's heavy guns after the rain was the first, most damning physical evidence that the political treachery had been reinforced by an unforgivable technical failure. Clive, a commander of cold logic, needed only to wait for this inevitable moment to transition from disciplined defense to decisive counterattack. The true turning point of the Battle of Plassey arrived not in a heroic charge, but in a sudden, torrential downpour that fundamentally altered the tactical conditions on the ground. This event, often described by simplistic accounts as a twist of fate, was in reality the devastating consequence of the Nawab's logistical failure and the crowning validation of Clive's calculated risk to protect his assets. By midday, following the ferocious, yet ultimately indecisive, cannonade from the French-led guns, a heavy, unseasonal burst of monsoon rain swept across the field of Plassey. This meteorological event was a common, anticipated phenomenon in Bengal during the late spring and early summer, yet the reaction of the two opposing armies to it was radically different, and it proved to be the ultimate determinant of the battle's outcome. The sheer arrogance and systemic incompetence that pervaded the Nawab's high command led directly to a fatal oversight. Confident in their overwhelming numbers and static, heavy artillery, the commanders had failed to adequately prepare for this environmental certainty. The vast quantities of gunpowder and ammunition supporting the Nawab's heavy cannons and the personal muskets of his infantry were either left uncovered or stored in facilities insufficient to withstand the deluge. The immediate result was catastrophic logistical failure. As the water saturated the unprotected stores, the powder became damp, rendering the majority of the Nawab's impressive arsenal inert. The powerful French-led guns, the only truly modern and loyal fighting element the Nawab possessed, were silenced. The illusion of the Nawab's firepower superiority vanished in a cloud of impotent steam. The grand army of 50,000 men was, in an instant, reduced to an army whose weapons were unusable, leaving them vulnerable to a foe that could still strike. Contrast this with the meticulous discipline and logistical foresight exhibited by Robert Clive's small force. Having established their defensive position in the mango grove, Clive's commanders had been instructed to ensure their powder stores were secured and covered, a fundamental requirement of European military professionalism in India. The sepoys and British regulars, demonstrating the adherence to doctrine instilled by Clive, worked swiftly to protect their own smaller, mobile ammunition supply with tarpaulins and tents. When the rain eventually eased, the difference was immediate and palpable. Clive's forces were able to emerge from the grove with dry powder and operational weapons. The Nawab's forces, meanwhile, were struggling amidst the saturated earth and their own ruined logistical apparatus. This moment marked the complete reversal of tactical momentum. The calculated risk taken by Clive, to rely on military discipline and professional logistics, had paid its immense dividend. The monsoon interruption was not simply bad luck for the Nawab, it was a consequence of his court's systemic inability to maintain professional military standards. In a long, global war defined by logistical and technological superiority, the Nawab's failure to adequately protect his powder proved to be an unforgivable technical mistake, a lapse in professionalism that no amount of numerical superiority could mitigate. It was a failure of the military bureaucracy that the EIC had so ruthlessly exploited throughout the entire campaign. This tactical paralysis was the final, devastating signal the conspirators needed. Seeing the massive, silent, and immobile mass of the Nawab's artillery, Mir Jafar and the other generals understood that the decisive moment had arrived. The weather had simply reinforced the political contract they had already signed. Clive, observing the silence of the enemy guns, immediately recognized that the time for disciplined defense was over, and the time for decisive, calculated aggression had arrived. The monsoon had not only stopped the battle, it had fundamentally prepared the ground for the coup's military execution. The paralysis that gripped the majority of the Nawab's army following the devastating logistical failure of the monsoon was briefly, but heroically, broken by a counterintuitive and fatal charge led by the only truly loyal, aggressive commander in Siraj ud-Daulah's camp, Mir Muddan. This desperate act of fidelity was the crucial tactical climax that provided Clive with the definitive proof that the loyalty of the Nawab's military assets had been irreparably segmented. Mir Muddan, unlike the treacherous Mir Jafar and the other conspirators, was a commander of honor and commitment. He witnessed the shame of the silent guns and the mass inertia of his colleagues. Knowing that the advantage held by sheer numbers was evaporating, and that the EIC, with its dry powder, was preparing to move, Mir Muddan recognized that a desperate act of aggression was the only chance to recover the battle's momentum. He concluded that waiting for the rain-soaked powder to dry would mean certain defeat. He launched a daring, rapid assault designed to disrupt the EIC's position before Clive could transition from defense to attack. Leading a contingent of loyal cavalry and the most steadfast of the infantry, Mir Muddan burst forth from the Nawab's center. His objective was clear: to force a close-quarters engagement, neutralizing the EIC's vilifier advantage and overwhelming their small force with sheer momentum. This charge was the only moment of genuine military peril for Robert Clive's contingent during the entire battle. Had this aggressive maneuver been supported by the massive reserves under Mir Jafar and the other commanders, the charge might well have broken the EIC's line in the mango grove. The disciplined British and sepoy forces, sheltered in the grove, found themselves momentarily under immense pressure as the Loyalists closed the distance, relying on sheer brute force and martial spirit. However, Mir Muddan's heroism was tragically isolated. The treacherous commanders, positioned just kilometers away, deliberately held back their reserves. Their agreement with Clive was not to fight, but to remain inert. Thus, the Loyalist charge, while brave and potent, became a highly concentrated, isolated target, devoid of the necessary supporting waves of infantry and artillery fire that would have ensured success. Clive, maintaining his cold, measured command, instructed his forces to meet the charge with disciplined, concentrated fire. The EIC sepoys and regulars, operating within the security of their defensive position, delivered rapid, synchronized volleys, precisely targeting the advancing cavalry. The density of the fire against the concentrated target was devastating. In the ensuing clash, Mir Muddan, the sole aggressive Loyalist general, was struck down and killed. The demise of Mir Muddan was more than a military casualty. It was the psychological and tactical watershed of the battle. His death instantly decapitated the Loyalist command structure and signaled to the remaining loyal troops that their cause was lost. More critically, it signaled to the wavering Nawab, Siraj ud-Daulah, that his fate was sealed. Upon hearing the news, the Nawab's confidence, already undermined by the widespread conspiracy and the silence of his guns, completely collapsed. He sent frantic messages to Mir Jafar, begging him to take the field. Mir Jafar, with the prize now within sight, offered only equivocal advice: retreat, regroup, and fight another day. This counsel was, in effect, the final act of betrayal, clearing the field for Clive. The heroic charge, designed to save the Nawab's regime, had ironically confirmed its destruction. The death of Mir Muddan served as the final piece of evidence that the numerical superiority of the Nawab's army was a paper tiger, easily felled by a combination of disciplined fire and the absolute certainty of political treachery. The field was now open for Clive to execute the military conclusion of the coup. The Battle of Plassey was ultimately won not by aggressive action, but by a profound, pervasive state of military inertia. The fate of the Nawab's army was sealed by the silence of treason, the calculated, frozen command paralysis orchestrated by Mir Jafar and the other conspirators. This chapter of the battle's technical climax is an examination of political will triumphing over military might, where the sheer weight of numbers was deliberately rendered irrelevant. Mir Jafar, positioned on the far flank of the massive Bengali army, commanded perhaps half of the total force, a substantial contingent that, if committed, would have easily overwhelmed Clive's small army. Yet, throughout the entire morning, from the initial French cannonade through the heavy monsoon rain and the consequential death of Mir Muddan, Mir Jafar's forces remained motionless. This was not due to cowardice, but to the meticulous execution of the political contract forged in the shadow negotiations. His inaction was the physical manifestation of his betrayal. The tactical significance of this paralysis cannot be overstated. The Nawab's army was fighting a two-front war, the external threat of Clive's disciplined fire and the internal threat of its own high command. Every time the Nawab's forces achieved a tactical advantage, such as the initial, successful French barrage, Mir Jafar failed to follow up. Every time a critical moment arose, such as the need to protect the powder, or to support Mir Muddan's loyalist charge, Mir Jafar and his fellow conspirators, notably ud-Daulah, remained frozen. Their deployment on the flank, geographically separated from the action where the French and Mir Mudden's loyalists were engaged, was critical. This separation was the physical safeguard of the conspiracy. It allowed the conspirators to observe the action, calculate the risk, and most importantly, prevent their own troops, who were, in fact, professional soldiers, from accidentally engaging the EIC in an unscripted, genuine fight. The political objective was never to win a battle for the Nawab. It was to ensure the Nawab's inevitable defeat was achieved with minimum cost to the conspirators and maximum assurance to Clive. The death of Mir Mudden proved to be the pivotal moment for Mir Jafar. It was the sign that the loyalist core of the Nawab's army had been neutralized. At this point, the distressed Nawab sent urgent, frantic messages to Mir Jafar, pleading with him to take the field, to lead the vast, inert reserves into action. This was Mir Jafar's supreme moment of deceit. He approached the Nawab not with defiance, but with false counsel. Mir Jafar advised Siraj ud-Daulah to withdraw his troops to their entrenched camp, assuring him that they would rally and fight a decisive battle the following morning. This advice was deliberately calculated to achieve two things. First, to persuade the Nawab to voluntarily relinquish the field, thereby confirming his defeat, and second, to signal to Clive that the final stage of the contract, the clearing of the battlefield, was underway. The Nawab, shattered by the death of his most loyal general and overwhelmed by the perceived wisdom of his commander-in-chief, issued the fatal order to his troops to retreat to the camp. This act of voluntary withdrawal was the moment the conspiracy was militarily executed. The retreat quickly dissolved into a disorganized rout as Clive, observing the enemy pulling back, seized the immediate advantage. The silence of treason achieved what no amount of EIC bravery could have done alone. It immobilized 50,000 men. It demonstrated that in the high-stakes politics of 18th-century Bengal, the decisive weapon was not the cannon or the bayonet, but the purchased disloyalty of the commanding officers. The vast bulk of the Nawab's army was defeated not by being outfought, but by being commanded into paralysis by its own leadership. Plassey was the perfect, chilling proof of concept for the EIC's strategy of indirect rule through indigenous political betrayal. The Nawab's army had just been immobilized by treachery and demoralized by the death of Mir Mudden and the subsequent counsel of withdrawal offered by Mir Jafar. This was the moment Robert Clive had anticipated. His response was immediate and calculated, the transition from disciplined defense to decisive, calculated aggression. This movement was the military execution of the political victory, ensuring the coup was irreversible. Clive understood that the Nawab's order to retreat was not a strategic maneuver, but a sign of systemic collapse. A traditional, cautious commander might have held the safety of the mango grove, content to see the enemy retire. But Clive knew the nature of his enemy. Their strength lay in passive intimidation, and their weakness lay in their brittle command structure. He knew that any pause would allow the Nawab's forces, even under compromised leadership, a chance to rally, regroup, or discover the full extent of the betrayal. The momentum, purchased so dearly through deceit and logistics, could not be forfeited. At approximately 2 p.m., Clive gave the order for the great counterattack. It was a measured, tactical advance, not a headlong rush. He deployed his small force, the 900 Europeans and 2,100 sepoys, in 3 columns. The objective was not to chase the retreating army across the plain, but to seize the strategically vital positions they had just abandoned, the French positions and the central hunting lodge and redoubt. This move demonstrated a profound understanding of psychological warfare and tactical concentration. Clive's infantry advanced swiftly across the open ground, their movements precise and disciplined. Unlike the Nawab's feudal levies, the EIC troops maintained perfect formation. This disciplined movement was in itself a powerful visual statement, a small, professional force moving confidently and deliberately toward an enemy many times its size, signaling to both the loyalists and the conspirators that the power dynamic had shifted completely. The initial target was the abandoned French position near the redoubt. The French commander, having lost the support of the main army and seeing his artillery rendered useless by the rain, had already begun to withdraw. Clive's swift advance was crucial here. His troops occupied the high ground of the mound and the buildings, turning the former enemy asset into a forward fire base. From this elevation, the EIC forces could now command a superior view of the plains and deliver precise, plunging fire into the massed ranks of the retreating Bengali army. The effect of this aggressive movement on the already demoralized Nawab's army was devastating. What began as an orderly withdrawal, advised by Mir Jafar, quickly devolved into a disorganized rout. The troops retreating toward the entrenched camp saw the company forces occupying the high ground they had just left. They had been told they were regrouping, they now saw themselves being aggressively pursued and outflanked. Clive's forces made relentless use of their disciplined volley fire. As the Nawab's formations broke, the EIC troops and sepoys delivered concentrated musket fire into the confused masses, maximizing the casualty rate and accelerating the collapse. The Nawab's cavalry, deprived of effective artillery support and lacking command cohesion, could not effectively counterattack the disciplined formations of the EIC. They were caught between their own retreating columns and the relentless, organized advance. This phase of the battle was the final, irreversible confirmation of the political conspiracy. The immense reserves under Mir Jafar and ud-Daulah, watching the chaos unfold, made absolutely no move to intervene. Their silence was the active ingredient of the rout. The Nawab's army, already betrayed by its generals, was now shattered by Clive's decisive aggression. The military action confirmed the change in regime. The company was now the dominant military power on the field, capable of forcing the pace and exploiting the structural weaknesses of the old regime. Within hours, the vast army of Bengal ceased to exist as a functional fighting force, routed by a determined advance of a small fraction of its number. The momentum generated by Clive's decisive order for a counterattack focused immediately on securing the critical piece of high ground abandoned by the French contingent, the small hill or mound adjacent to the hunting lodge. The execution of this flanking maneuver was the final, tactical nail in the coffin of the Nawab's regime, effectively locking the EIC into a position of irreversible battlefield dominance. As the Nawab's army began its disorganized retreat following the failure of the Loyalist charge, the French artillery unit, sensing the shift in political and military fortunes, was forced to withdraw its remaining men and guns. Clive immediately recognized this momentary gap in the enemy's front line. He ordered a small, agile detachment of his force, combining sepoy light infantry and elements of the British 39th Regiment of Foot, to advance rapidly out of the protection of the mango grove and seize the now vacant French position. This was a classic flanking maneuver executed under pressure. It was not a frontal assault against the main body of the enemy, but a swift, diagonal push designed to occupy a commanding tactical height. The troops moved with professional urgency, ensuring their formations remained tight and their powder dry. This disciplined movement was paramount, as they were momentarily exposed to fire from the retreating masses and the uncommitted formations of the conspirators. The successful capture of the mound was the moment the EIC achieved tactical superiority. By establishing a foothold on this elevated ground, Clive's forces acquired a clear, unobstructed line of sight and an elevated firing position over the entire battlefield and the Nawab's entrenched camp behind it. From this vantage point, the EIC could deliver plunging fire, musket balls and grapeshot fired at a downward angle into the dense, panicked ranks of the retreating enemy. The effect of this elevated fire was devastating, both materially and psychologically. Firstly, it maximized casualties among the demoralized Bengali troops, transforming an orderly retreat into a headlong flight. Secondly, it acted as a visible, physical signal to every soldier on the field that the Nawab's defense had been utterly compromised. The sight of the red and white uniforms on the mound, firing down upon them, shattered any remaining illusion that the day's action was merely a temporary skirmish. Crucially, the occupation of the mound also solidified the position of Mir Jafar's forces. Having been instructed by Mir Jafar to retreat to the camp, the troops saw the EIC now occupying their most advantageous forward position. This provided Mir Jafar with the perfect cover for his continued treachery. He could now claim that the situation was irretrievable and that further action was impossible, thereby justifying his ongoing command paralysis. The fait accompli was made visible to all. The operation was secured when Clive ordered his remaining battalions to advance out of the mango grove and consolidate their position with the detachment on the mound. The entire EIC force was now positioned on ground formerly held by the enemy, having achieved a complete reversal of the tactical geometry without engaging the full numerical might of the Nawab's army. The flanking maneuver and the capture of the mound confirmed that Plassey was a victory of maneuver and calculation over brute force. It was the moment that the political victory, the paralysis of command, was translated into unassailable military dominance, forcing the Nawab to abandon the field and confirming the coup. The final, desperate resistance was overcome, and the path to the Nawab's camp and treasury lay open. The military conclusion of the Battle of Plassey was swift and disproportionate. Once the Nawab's army had broken into a general rout, precipitated by the silence of treason and Clive's decisive counterattack, the engagement became a pursuit rather than a fight. The technical assessment of the battle's immediate aftermath reveals the stark reality of the military asymmetry and the absolute nature of the political victory. The disparity in casualties immediately confirmed the true nature of the day's action. The immense, 50,000-strong Bengali army, despite its heavy artillery and cavalry, suffered an estimated 500 to 1,500 casualties, killed and wounded. Conversely, Robert Clive's entire force, a mere 3,000 men, sustained a negligible toll, 22 killed and 50 wounded, the majority of these incurred during the initial, disciplined phase of the French cannonade. This casualty ratio, bordering on 150, serves as the most damning, empirical evidence that the Nawab's army did not fight a genuine battle, it was politically decommissioned. The loss of life was restricted almost entirely to the loyalist minority who, under Mir Mudun, had attempted to resist the engineered collapse. With the Nawab, Siraj ud-Daulah, having abandoned the field and fled toward his capital at Murshidabad, the EIC's focus immediately shifted from military consolidation to the inventory of spoils. The immediate strategic consequence was the complete physical and psychological collapse of the old regime. Clive, now joined by the belated and self-serving appearance of Mir Jafar and his vast, inert contingent, advanced to the Nawab's heavily fortified camp. The real prize was the treasury. The victory at Plassey was not fought for territory in the conventional sense, but for the unprecedented wealth of Bengal. The financial terms of the unholy alliance were now due, and they were levied with relentless efficiency. The EIC, its officers, and its political allies proceeded to extract a fortune of staggering proportions, establishing a pattern of rapacious extraction that would characterize the next century of British rule. The immediate financial inventory demanded by the EIC was immense. The company itself was awarded an indemnity of £1 million for its losses at Calcutta and the costs of the campaign. The European inhabitants of Calcutta were granted another £500,000. Crucially, the key officers and members of the select committee involved in the conspiracy demanded and received vast personal gifts from the newly installed puppet Nawab, Mir Jafar, who was now bound by contract to pay them. Robert Clive himself, as the principal architect of the coup, received a sum estimated at £250,000, an extraordinary fortune in 1757, equivalent to over £40 million today, in addition to the grant of a massive zamindari, land revenue right, that brought him a personal annual income of £30,000. This immediate transfer of wealth was more than simple plunder. It was the capital infusion that fundamentally changed the trajectory of the British Empire. This immense influx of cash, largely transferred from Murshidabad to Calcutta, immediately shored up the EIC's shaky finances and provided the necessary capital for the national strategic imperative to fund the British war effort against France globally. The inventory of spoils was the tangible proof that Plassey was a financial transaction enforced by military threat. It transformed the EIC from a vulnerable trading company into the de facto sovereign power of Bengal, backed by a personal fortune that corrupted the morality of every officer involved. The true cost of the victory was not counted in casualties, but in the political and moral debt incurred by the massive, unprecedented seizure of Bengal's treasury. The immediate aftermath of the military rout at Plassey required a swift and decisive political finale to legitimize the engineered regime change. The true strategic goal of the campaign was not the destruction of the Bengali army, but the installation of a compliant ruler. This was achieved with the coronation of the puppet, the elevation of Mir Jafar to the position of Nawab, an act that created the illusion of legitimacy necessary for the British East India Company, EIC, to begin its systemic extraction of wealth. Within days of the battle, Robert Clive marched his triumphant, though small, force into the capital city of Murshidabad, the seat of Bengal's immense wealth and power. This entry was a carefully managed piece of political theatre. Clive did not enter as a conqueror on behalf of the British Crown, but as the de facto kingmaker, escorting his chosen candidate, Mir Jafar, to the throne. The ceremony that followed was crucial. Mir Jafar was richly installed as the new Nawab of Bengal. Clive, in a deliberate and highly symbolic gesture, performed the act of homage, formally saluting the new sovereign. This scene, the British officer bowing before the Indian prince, was fundamental to maintaining the illusion of legitimacy. It allowed the EIC to assert that they were merely supporting a legitimate, domestic transfer of power, acting as auxiliaries to a local ally, rather than engaging in outright conquest. The political narrative, however thin, was that the EIC was restoring stability following the tyrannical rule of Siraj ud-Daulah. In reality, Mir Jafar was nothing more than a figurehead, a puppet whose strings were held tightly by Clive and the EIC Select Committee. He had purchased the throne with a crippling financial contract, signing over both the treasury and the sovereignty of his government to the company's command. His power was derived solely from the continued backing of Clive's military presence. His tenure was a clear example of indirect rule, the political blueprint for much of the later British Empire. The EIC now possessed absolute authority without the administrative burden or the legal complexities of direct control. They could manipulate the revenue system, dictate trade policies, and demand further gifts and concessions, all while Mir Jafar's name appeared on the official decrees. The entire vast revenue apparatus of Bengal, the collection of taxes, customs duties, and the administration of justice, was nominally still under the Nawab's jurisdiction, but functionally controlled by the company's agents. The immediate strategic consequence of Mir Jafar's accession was the granting of the zamindari, revenue collection rights, over the massive territory south of Calcutta, making the company the largest landlord in the region. This secured the EIC's position not merely as a trading entity, but as a territorial sovereign capable of raising vast sums of revenue independently of the Mughal emperor or the Nawab's direct approval. This, coupled with the immense personal fortunes transferred to Clive and his colleagues, cemented the mercenary nature of the victory. The coronation of the puppet was thus the decisive political maneuver that secured the true spoils of Plassey. It cloaked an act of cynical political subversion in the formalities of local succession, creating a mechanism by which the EIC could systematically drain the wealth of Bengal for decades to come. Mir Jafar's role was to provide the face of indigenous rule while the company wielded the absolute power of military and fiscal control. The foundation of the British Empire in India was built on this legal fiction, an illusion of legitimacy that masked the profound political treachery at its core. The political tremors initiated at Plassey did not remain confined to the plains of Bengal. They soon reached the sophisticated, venal political arena of London, manifesting as the scandal of riches. Robert Clive's return to England, not as a titled aristocrat but as a man of prodigious, unprecedented personal wealth, forced a reckoning in Whitehall over the moral and fiscal legitimacy of the East India Company's actions. The immense sums Clive had personally acquired, the £250,000 gift from the puppet Nawab Mir Jafar, along with the subsequent revenue from his vast zamindari, were staggering, surpassing anything previously acquired by a British subject in India. This fortune, and those of the other so-called nabobs, EIC officials who had returned from India rich, instantly injected a destabilizing quantity of wealth into British politics and society. The sight of these men buying up boroughs, securing seats in Parliament, and living lives of ostentatious luxury fueled public outrage and, more importantly, political jealousy. This was not a moralistic outcry alone, it was a crisis of governance and fiduciary responsibility. Parliament, observing the EIC accumulating vast territorial control and unprecedented wealth while simultaneously teetering on the edge of financial collapse due to poor administration and corruption, began to view the company not just as a commercial partner but as a threat to the state's authority. The question became unavoidable: who truly controlled the revenues of Bengal, a private, self-serving corporation, or the British Crown? This mounting pressure eventually led to the parliamentary inquiry of the early 1770s. Clive, the central figure and most famous of the nabobs, was called before the House of Commons to defend the means by which he acquired his wealth and power. The focus of the interrogation was piercing and specific: the nature of the treaties, the use of forgery, specifically the Red Treaty that deceived Amin Chand, and the acceptance of vast private gifts from the newly installed Nawab. Clive's defense was a masterpiece of pragmatic political realism. He did not deny the transactions or the deception. Instead, he framed his actions as necessary for the national strategic interest and the solvency of the company during a time of global war. His famous, arrogant retort, "I stand astonished at my own moderation," when recounting the riches laid at his feet, was an attempt to preempt moral judgment by emphasizing the sheer scale of the temptation he had resisted. Though the committee harshly condemned the EIC's acquisition methods, ultimately, the political establishment found itself in a dilemma. Clive's crimes were inseparable from the very victory that had secured the company's revenue stream and, by extension, had propped up British credit during the 7 Years' War. Parliament, unwilling to fully undermine the foundational legitimacy of the Bengal conquest, officially exonerated Clive of criminal charges. However, the inquiries definitively exposed the moral vacuum at the heart of the EIC's rule and established the political justification for future regulatory acts, such as the Regulating Act of 1773, which sought to bring the company under greater state control. The scandal of riches was the necessary political friction that ultimately transitioned Bengal from the dominion of a corrupt corporation to the nascent control of the British state. The narrative of Plassey, when framed by the exploits of Robert Clive and the grand machinations of Whitehall, often renders the men who endured the heat and exchanged the musket fire as little more than statistics. Yet, the fate of the common soldier, both the British regular and, crucially, the sepoy, provides a solemn, necessary counterpoint to the scandal of riches. Their service was essential, their discipline decisive, but their reward was a stark contrast to the fortunes accumulated by their commanders. They were the engine of this new empire, and they were quickly relegated to the forgotten men of forgotten wars. The British regulars, often drawn from the poorest classes, were fighting in a climate and under conditions for which they were wholly unprepared. While Plassey itself was a low-casualty battle, the long-term mortality rate for European troops in India was staggering. Disease, dysentery, cholera, and malaria was the true enemy. Weeks and months after the brief fighting, the ranks of the British regiments were relentlessly thinned by the endemic illnesses of the subcontinent, far surpassing the losses incurred on any battlefield. These men received little of the immense bounty acquired by the EIC leadership. Their pay was meager, their conditions harsh, and their reward often only a wooden cross or a lonely burial in foreign soil. More poignant was the fate of the sepoy contingent, the disciplined backbone of Clive's victory. The sepoys had demonstrated professional loyalty and tactical excellence, proving the superiority of the EIC's military doctrine. They had won the empire for the company. Yet, while their British counterparts, for all their suffering, received eventual pensions and a return passage home, the sepoys' fate was more complex and ultimately more tragic. They were professional soldiers, but their status was perpetually subordinate. They received better pay than their counterparts in the Nawab's service, fostering the discipline that won the day. However, their ultimate political recognition was non-existent. They had delivered immense wealth to the company, but they watched as that wealth was transferred into the personal coffers of their European officers, generating a subtle, corrosive resentment. The immediate post-Plassey reality for the common soldier was a cycle of low-level garrison duty, harsh discipline, and continuous exposure to fatal disease. They were the instruments of the EIC's fiscal control, enforcing tax collection and ensuring the stability of the puppet regime, tasks that exposed them to the unpopularity of the new rule and the frequent dangers of local resistance. The forgotten wars they fought were the countless small, brutal skirmishes and punitive actions necessary to prop up the new regime and secure the flow of revenue. These actions, strategically invisible in the grand histories of the empire, exacted a continuous, high toll on the ranks. The common soldiers, both British and Indian, were sacrificed to maintain the vast, corrupt, and ultimately self-serving financial structure engineered by their commanders. Their legacy is not found in monuments of victory, but in the forgotten mortality lists and the quiet, persistent erosion of their morale caused by the realization that their bravery had merely enriched a distant corporation and a handful of ruthless men. The immediate financial spoils secured at Plassey for the East India Company and its officers represented only the first, visible layer of extraction. The true, devastating consequence of the political coup was the long shadow of Plassey, the economic mechanisms set in motion that led directly to one of the subcontinent's worst humanitarian disasters, the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. This consequence revealed the profound moral vacuum inherent in the EIC's new position as the de facto sovereign power. Plassey granted the EIC, through their puppet Nawab, control over Bengal's revenue and trade. This control was formalized and expanded in 1765 when Clive secured the Diwani, the right to collect and administer the land revenue, from the Mughal emperor. This single act was the legal foundation for the economic catastrophe. The EIC, a commercial entity obsessed with profit, was suddenly vested with the administrative power and responsibility of a government, yet it retained the singular focus of a corporation, maximizing returns for shareholders. The core of the problem was the drain of wealth. The EIC ceased relying on importing gold or silver from Britain to purchase Indian goods. Instead, they used the vast land revenues collected from Bengal's own farmers and populace to fund their investments, purchases of Indian textiles, saltpeter, and other goods for export back to London. This meant that the company was, in essence, buying goods with no money outflow from Britain. The capital of Bengal was used to purchase the products of Bengal, which were then sold for profit in Europe. This system created an immense, continuous hemorrhage of wealth out of the province, stripping the region of its capital base and destabilizing its traditional economy. Furthermore, the EIC's new revenue system was implemented with a ruthless efficiency unseen before. The traditional revenue assessments were significantly inflated, and collection was rigidly enforced by EIC agents and their local contractors. When agricultural production faltered, as it inevitably did, the demand for revenue was not relaxed. This aggressive, unrelenting demand for cash drained the reserves of the peasant farmers, leaving them with no surplus to rely upon in times of scarcity. The tipping point arrived in 1769 with the failure of the monsoon rains. Bengal faced severe drought and crop failure. Under any previous regime, the government would have traditionally provided tax relief, released stored grain, and halted exorbitant revenue collection. However, the EIC and its local revenue farmers, driven by the mandate from London to maintain the flow of capital, refused to implement meaningful relief. In many areas, the revenue collection was actually intensified, as officials sought to recoup shortfalls. The result was the devastating Bengal Famine of 1770, which, in its sheer scale, remains one of the greatest moral indictments of the company's rule. Historians estimate that 10 million people, approximately one-third of Bengal's population, perished from starvation and disease. The tragedy was not merely a natural disaster, it was a man-made catastrophe exacerbated by the EIC's cynical and morally bankrupt administrative policy that prioritized profit over human life. The famine was the final, brutal proof that the political treachery of Plassey had yielded not just an empire, but a systemic failure of governance that cost millions of lives. The long arc of the narrative culminates not on the field of Plassey, but in the troubled conscience and ultimate fate of the man who engineered the victory, Robert Clive. Plassey created the British Empire in India, yet its foundational principles, treachery, corruption, and financial rapacity, levied a profound moral cost that demanded an unsettling reckoning for its architect. Clive returned to England celebrated as the heaven-born general who had secured the most lucrative territory in the world. He used his vast wealth to enter Parliament and secure titles. Yet, his final years were consumed by the very machinations he had used to achieve his greatness. The parliamentary inquiries, fueled by political jealousy and genuine moral outrage over the excesses of the nabobs, forced Clive to confront the ethics of his actions. Though ultimately exonerated of criminal charges, the public debate had irrevocably tarnished his reputation, revealing his methods as morally compromised. He was forced to publicly defend forgery, bribery, and the mercenary acquisition of wealth, arguing that these actions were necessary evils to save the state. The ultimate tragedy of Clive's enduring political legacy is the paradox of his achievement. He provided the necessary capital infusion that enabled Britain to prosecute the 7 Years' War to a decisive, global victory over France. Without the wealth channeled from Bengal, Britain's financial solvency would have been questionable, and the history of the entire global conflict might have been reversed. In this cold, strategic sense, Clive was undeniably a savior of the British Empire. However, his methods established a toxic imperial blueprint. Plassey taught the EIC that the most efficient way to conquer a rich territory was not through overwhelming force, but through elite subversion and financial coercion. This model of indirect rule, where local authorities acted as puppets to extract revenue, became the standard operating procedure for much of the subsequent century of expansion. This system of extraction, divorced from the responsibility of good governance, led directly to the economic catastrophe of the Bengal Famine, a disaster that stands as the profoundest moral debt incurred by the victory at Plassey. Clive himself, despite his immense wealth and political power, never found peace. He suffered from chronic health problems and a crippling addiction to opium, conditions often attributed to the severe psychological and physical stress of his command in India. In 1774, at the age of 49, he committed suicide. The unsettling reckoning of Robert Clive and the Battle of Plassey is this: the greatest triumph of the early British Empire was a triumph of cynicism. It was a political coup executed by military contract, driven by financial greed, and founded upon the betrayal of indigenous allies. The victory secured the wealth that made Britain a global superpower, but it simultaneously inaugurated an era of corporate misrule and systematic plunder that cost millions of Bengali lives. Clive's death, a solitary, despairing end to a life of extraordinary achievement, serves as a final, solemn reflection on the moral cost of an empire built upon foundations of treachery and avarice. The empire was won, but the moral debt was inescapable.